Some stories end at the proposal. Theirs was only beginning. A poor African maid had crossed an ocean to save her dying mother, only to be lied about, cast out of a Korean billionaire's mansion, and left with nothing, not even knowing she carried the family's only heir. But the truth clawed its way to the surface. The man who let her go tore the city apart to find her, and on a rooftop beneath the glowing lights of Seoul, he asked her to spend the rest of her life with him, and she slid the ring onto her own finger. They thought the hardest part was behind them. Before we go on, ask yourself this. What would you do if the people with all the money, all the power, and all the lawyers decided your child was in their way? Because that is exactly what she was about to face. And how she answered that question will surprise you. If you believe the people the world underestimates are often the strongest of all, tap that like button and subscribe, because you will not want to miss how this ends. Now, let's begin. They had no idea the real battle hadn't even begun. For a little while, life was gentle. Zara moved into a warm home that was theirs, not the cold marble of the Kwon estate, but somewhere that belonged to both of their worlds, and neither. Her mother, Gloria, recovered fully and flew in from Atlanta, filling the rooms with gospel hummed under her breath, and the smell of food cooked slow with love. Jun-ho was a different man now, lighter, present, awake. He would rest his hand on Zara's growing belly in the evenings and marvel at the small kicks beneath his palm, like they were the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to anyone. For the first time in a long time, Zara let herself believe that the worst was over. But the wealthy do not let go of their own so easily, and an empire, once threatened, does not simply forgive. It began with small things. A car that seemed to sit too long outside their gate, a phone that rang and went silent when Zara answered, letters with no return address. Jun-ho told her not to worry, that his family name attracted attention, that it was nothing. He was wrong. It was not nothing. Because far across the city, in the cold halls of the Kwon estate, two very different people were watching the news of the engagement with two very different kinds of fury. The first was Hyun-ah. She had lost. Publicly, humiliatingly, completely. The engagement that was to make her a Kwon had been called off in front of everyone, and the man she had spent years shaping her life around had chosen a maid, a pregnant maid, over her. Most people, after a defeat like that, would retreat and rebuild elsewhere. Hyun-ah was not most people. She had never wanted Jun-ho the way you want a person. She wanted what he represented, and she was not finished reaching for it. The second was a man nobody had spoken of in years. There is always a secret in families like the Kwons, a door that stays closed, a name that makes the room go quiet. For the Kwons, that name was Kwon Do-yoon. He was the eldest son, Jun-ho's half-brother, born of the patriarch's first marriage, cast out of the family decades ago, after a scandal the family had spent a fortune burying. He had grown up bitter and brilliant in the shadow of the family that erased him, and he had spent his adult life abroad, building his own fortune and nursing a single, patient ambition to come home and take what he believed had always been his. For years, the Kwon inheritance had a clear path. Jun-ho was the heir. The bloodline continued through him. Do-yoon's claim, however old, meant little against a living, legitimate son. But then Do-yoon learned two things that changed everything. The first was that Jun-ho had walked away from the family, renounced the arranged marriage, defied his mother, abandoned the estate for love. In the eyes of the old traditionalists on the Kwon board, a son who abandoned his duty had weakened his claim. The second was the child. Do-yoon learned that there was to be a baby, the only grandchild of the Kwon patriarch, the one person whose existence could lock the inheritance to Junho's line forever and shut Do-yoon out for good. And so, in the quiet, calculating way of a man who has waited decades, Kwon Do-yoon came home, not with anger, with papers, with lawyers, with a claim to the empire, and a chilling, quiet interest in the child who stood between him and everything he wanted. He did not come alone in his scheming, because a man like that always looks for someone on the inside, someone with their own reasons to want Zara gone. He found Hyuna. They met in a quiet, expensive place, the way people meet when they don't want to be seen. Hyuna wanted Junho, or failing that, she wanted the maid to suffer for taking him. Do-yoon wanted the empire and needed Junho's line weakened and his household in chaos. Their goals were not the same, but their enemy was. And so they made the kind of bargain that ruins everyone who touches it. Hyuna knew the family, knew Junho, knew exactly where to press to cause pain. Do-yoon had the resources, the lawyers, and the cold patience to bring an empire down. Together, they began to move against the little family that had dared to be happy. It started with the wedding. Junho and Zara had chosen a small ceremony, nothing like the grand Kwon affairs, just the people they loved. But planning a wedding leaves a trail, and a trail can be poisoned. Vendors cancelled without explanation, their venue mysteriously double-booked. A whisper campaign began in the social circles that mattered, painting Zara as a scheming foreigner who had trapped a billionaire with a pregnancy, the oldest, cruelest lie in the book, and one that certain people were all too willing to believe. Zara felt it before she understood it. The stares, the cancelled fittings, the way doors that had begun to open were quietly closing again. And then the letter came, formal, legal, bearing a name Junho had not seen in 20 years. Kwon Do-yoon was contesting the inheritance, and he was requesting, demanding, legal establishment of the paternity and status of the unborn child, framing it not as a grandfather's joy, but as a matter of property, of succession, of who would control the Kwon fortune. Their baby had become a piece on a chessboard, and somewhere out there, two people who wished them harm were deciding how to use it. Here is the thing they all underestimated, every single time. They thought Zara was fragile because she was poor. They thought she was breakable because she had been broken before. They thought that a woman who had been thrown out once could be frightened into running again. They were wrong, and they would learn it the hard way, because the Zara who faced this was not the frightened girl who had stepped off a plane at Incheon with one suitcase. This was a woman who had survived a false accusation, built a business from nothing in a foreign land, kept her dying mother alive with the work of her own hands, and walked back into the arms of the man who wronged her only on her own terms. She had been to the bottom. She knew the way back up. And she was carrying a child now, which meant the fear that used to be about herself had become something far fiercer. They wanted to frighten a maid. Instead, they woke a mother. When Junho, pale and shaken, showed her the legal papers, she did not cry. She read every line, twice. Then she looked up at him and said the words that would define everything that came after. They think this baby is a weakness they can use against us. We are going to show them it is the strongest thing we have. And she began, quietly and methodically, to fight. That night, Zara sat with her mother in the kitchen, the way she had 1,000 times across a whole life. Gloria was well now, the cancer that had started this entire story beaten back, her strength returned, and she watched her daughter with the eyes of a woman who had raised her alone through every hard thing the world could throw. They're coming for the baby, Zara said. For the name. For everything. Gloria was quiet for a long moment. Then she said the thing Zara needed to hear. Baby, let me tell you something about people who use children as weapons. They always lose. Not because the world is fair. Lord knows it isn't. But because a child pulls the truth out of people. It shows you exactly who's willing to hurt something innocent to get what they want. And once everybody can see that clearly, once the mask comes off, those people destroy themselves. She took her daughter's hand. You don't have to be their kind of ruthless. You just have to be patient and let them show everyone what they really are. The truth always comes home. You taught me that, remember? Zara held on to those words like a rope across the dark, and in the weeks that followed, that is exactly what happened. She did not sink to their level. She let them climb to the top of their own scheming, and waited for the fall. An alliance built on two different kinds of greed is a fragile thing. Hyuna wanted Junho to suffer, but a part of her, a part she hated, still wanted him. Watching Do-Yun's cold plans, she began to realize that this man did not simply want to hurt Zara or win Junho back for her. He wanted the child neutralized, the line broken, the whole family gutted, so he could feast on the remains. And Hyuna, for all her cruelty, had not signed up to harm a baby. She had wanted revenge on a rival, not this. Meanwhile, Do-Yun was growing impatient with her. She was useful for her knowledge of the family, but she was emotional, unpredictable, still tangled in feelings for the very man he intended to ruin. He began to make plans that did not include her, plans to move directly against Junho's control of the company, to pressure the Kwon board, to use the paternity claim not to acknowledge the child, but to tie the family up in a scandal so vast it would break Junho's standing entirely. And in the middle of it all, someone unexpected began to stir. Madame Kwon. She had spent the time since her confession in a kind of exile of her own making, humbled, ashamed, slowly and genuinely trying to become someone her son could forgive. She had apologized to Zara. She had begun, carefully, to earn her way back, and now she watched a man she had never trusted, a son her husband had cast out long ago, circling her family like a wolf, threatening the very grandchild that represented the family's future. Whatever Madame Kwon had been, and she had been cruel, and calculating, and wrong, she was, above all, fiercely protective of the Kwon bloodline, and Do-Yun was a threat to it far greater than any maid had ever been. For the first time in this entire story, Madame Kwon and Zara wanted exactly the same thing. It was Madame Kwon who came to them. She arrived at their home the way she had arrived at Zara's apartment once before, without her armor, without her pride, an older woman who had learned, too late, but not entirely too late, what mattered. I know I have no right to ask you to trust me, she said. I have earned nothing from either of you, but I know that man. I grew up in this family's shadows, and I know what Do-Yun is capable of. He will not stop at the company. He wants the child erased from the line, and there is a coldness in him that frightens even me. She looked at Zara, fully, the way she had learned to. You beat me because you were stronger, and better than I gave you credit for. Let me stand with you now, against something worse than I ever was. And so an alliance formed that no one could have predicted. The woman who had once destroyed Zara, now standing beside her to protect Zara's child. Madame Kwon knew the family's secrets, the board's loyalties, the skeletons in every closet. Zara had the one thing Madame Kwon had always lacked, a clean conscience, and the moral high ground, and Junho, who had walked away from the empire, now had a reason to walk back into it. not for himself, but for his family. Together, they began to turn the tables. They did not beat Do-yoon with cruelty. They beat him with the truth, exactly as Gloria had said. Madame Kwon, using her decades of knowledge, quietly gathered the evidence of how Do-yoon had been operating, the pressure he'd applied, the alliances he'd bought, the whisper campaign against Zara that traced back to his money. And Hyuna, sickened at last by how far Do-yoon was willing to go, made a choice that surprised even herself. She turned. She came to Zara, the woman she had schemed against, the rival she had helped to destroy, and she told the truth. All of it. Do-yoon's plans, his intentions toward the child, the whole cold architecture of his scheme. It did not undo what Hyuna had done, but it was, perhaps, the first genuinely decent act of her adult life, and it broke Do-yoon's plan wide open. Because a scheme like Do-yoon's only works in the dark. The moment it was dragged into the light, the moment the Kwon board and the wider world could see a man willing to threaten an unborn child to seize a fortune, his support collapsed. The traditionalists who had entertained his claim recoiled. No amount of old bitterness or legal maneuvering could survive being seen so clearly. The mask came off, and underneath it, everyone saw exactly what Gloria had promised they would see. Do-yoon, exposed and disgraced, lost everything he had come home to take. The empire closed ranks against him. His claim collapsed, and the man who had waited decades to steal a family's future was cast out of it once more, this time by his own actions, in front of everyone. In the quiet after the storm, there were reckonings of a gentler kind. Hyuna left Seoul. Before she went, she and Zara spoke one last time, not as friends, they would never be that, but as two women who had come through something, and out the other side. Hyuna did not ask for forgiveness she hadn't earned. She simply said she was sorry, and that she hoped the child would grow up never knowing how close the world had come to being cruel to it. And then she was gone, to build some other life somewhere else, a little more human than she had been. Madame Kwon and Zara arrived at something that was not quite mother and daughter, but was real, a wary, hard-won respect. The older woman had proven, when it counted most, that she had truly changed, that she would stand between danger and Zara's child without hesitation. And Zara, who understood better than anyone that people can be more than the worst thing they've done, let her in, slowly, on her own terms, the way she did everything. And Junho watched the two women who had once been enemies stand together in his home, protecting his family, and understood that the world he had been born into, the cold, ruthless world of the Kwon name, had finally, against all odds, been changed by the warmth this one woman had brought into it. They had the wedding after all, not the grand Kwon spectacle, and not the small hidden ceremony the schemers had tried to poison. Something better than both, a celebration full of the people who had truly stood by them. Gloria, radiant and healthy, walking her daughter forward. Madame Kwon, humbled and transformed, seated where family sits. Sung-min, the guard whose conscience had started the whole unraveling, given a place of honor. The Nigerian neighbor who had fed Zara soup in her darkest days, laughing in the front row. Zara walked toward Junho carrying their child, and she was not the frightened girl who had come to Korea to survive, and she was not the maid the world had looked down on, and she was not the victim they had tried to make her. She was exactly who she had always been underneath everything, a woman of quiet, unbreakable strength, who had crossed an ocean, survived every cruelty, and built a life on her own terms out of nothing but faith and work and love. And when they asked if she would take this man, she looked at him, The man who had once failed her, and had spent everything he had becoming worthy of her, and she said yes, the way she had taken the ring on the rooftop, on her own terms, with her whole heart, afraid of nothing anymore. The baby came in the spring, a child born of two worlds, Atlanta and Seoul, an African mother and a Korean father, a bloodline that fools had fought over as if it were a possession, and that turned out to be, in the end, simply a beloved child. The only heir to the Kwon name, yes, but more than that, and better than that, a child who would grow up in a home full of the one thing all the money in that empire had never been able to buy: warmth. Zara held her child in the quiet of the morning, her mother humming in the next room, her husband asleep after a long night of new parent joy, and she thought about all of it: the plane, the suitcase, the cold estate, the lie, the long walk out into a city that owed her nothing, the rooftop, the battle for this small life in her arms. And she thought about what she would tell this child someday, when they were old enough to ask where they came from. She would tell them the truth, that their mother came from nothing the world respected, and everything that actually mattered, that she was underestimated at every turn, by people who mistook her quietness for weakness, and her kindness for something they could exploit, and that every single one of them learned, in the end, the same lesson. Her grandmother used to say there are three kinds of doors in this life: the ones that open inward, the ones that open outward, and the wisest ones, the ones you have to build yourself. Zara Coleman had built hers. She had walked through it standing tall, and now, at last, she was holding the whole reason it had all been worth it. Some people come into your life like answers. Her child came into it like a promise, finally, beautifully kept. From a maid with nothing, to a mother who protected an empire's future and never once lost herself. This was always her story. It just took the world a while to understand that. Thanks for watching.